Hello and welcome to the Dedicated Show. Really excited to have you joining us here today on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Twitch. We have a very special guest with us, Kurt Cagle, who is the community editor at Data Science Central. He's going to talk to us about the future of work in a data-driven world. I think it is such a relevant topic since it is a data-driven world, and the future of work is always changing. I know he has some really great thoughts on this. Before I bring him on, I do want to ask everybody a question, and the question is, have you changed jobs since the pandemic? So let us know. In my mind, the pandemic really started around January 2020. Some say it's March 2020, but I guess around that time frame. Have you changed jobs since the pandemic? Let us know in the comments, and we'll read through as many comments as we can. We are also taking questions throughout the session. So if you have questions around the future of work or anything else that Kurt and I talk about, put that in the comments from wherever you are joining us from, and we will make sure to address them. Okay. I also want to tell you about today's giveaway. The hashtag we're using for today is hashtag Dedicated. And what we're giving away today is the Dedicated Inner Circle membership, which is a $300 value. You will get this for free, which provides you with access to monthly live sessions with experts, monthly book of the month discussions, as well as 10 on-demand courses from data storytelling to the Data to Dashboard series with courses on Python, R, Tableau, Power BI, Domo, and several others. So all you have to do is put hashtag Dedicated. We will select 2 winners for the giveaway today. We'll announce the first winner about halfway through the show, and then we'll announce a second winner towards the end of the show. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to bring on our special guest here. Kurt, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thank you very much, Kate, for having me. When I was in high school, I did a play as the butler in 10 Little Indians, and I walked onto the stage carrying these big suitcases. I was the first person on the stage, and I just stood there thinking, "Oh my God, I have no idea what I'm going to say. How do I get going?" From the back, I heard, "Kurt, you're lying. Oh yeah." So, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us. Before we look into the comments and before we even start the whole conversation, I would love for you to provide an introduction for those who are not familiar with you. Who is Kurt?
Who is Kurt? God, he's a guy that wears many hats, most of them invisible. I have been working in the data space and information standard space for about 30 years. Worked with the original XML specifications. Did a lot of work in game design and multimedia back in the days, was early 90s, and have pretty much spent most of my entire life thinking about what exactly is data. What do we mean by data? What kind of things are data, and why is it important? And in the process, I've been working as both a technologist, work with a lot of Fortune 500 companies, something as an analyst, but also a lot of time spent writing as a journalist. I've written for Forbes. I've written for O'Reilly Media. I've just written.
You've written,
I have 25 books to my credit.
Wow.
And a couple novels here and there. But for the most part, I have really just kind of gotten into the whole aspect of how does data impact people, impact organizations? How does it shape the future? And so, I'm excited to be on the show because I think it's a perfect place to be able to ask those kind of questions.
Yes, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. We do have several people who have joined us in the chat here. Just Herb is eager to hear about robots doing his job for him. I see Petrie's joined us there. I want to see if we got some responses on whether people have changed jobs since the pandemic. And it looks like Christiane, yes, she's changed jobs. Molly has changed jobs in September. Herb has not had a job change. I did see some others. Yep, so Andrew here started his own data science infinity company since the lockdown. Dan has not changed jobs, but has shifted focus. I think it has impacted folks to an extent, even if they didn't actually change jobs. Others have opened consulting firms. So, really great to see everybody here. As I mentioned, definitely feel free to engage with both of us, ask questions, leave comments if you agree or disagree with things that we are saying. We're here to engage, we're here to talk things through. So, definitely keep that chat going. Kurt, so tell us more. How did you end up in Data Science Central, and maybe tell us a little bit about what is Data Science Central focused on?
I was a part of the Great Resignation. Actually, I had been queued up to start a project for, I wanted to think, I think it was the Ames research over at NASA. And unfortunately, just as we were getting to the point of saying, okay, let's start the project, the pandemic hit. And they looked at things and they got back to me and said, we'll get back to you sometime, but we don't know what's going on at this stage. And so I had been, so here it is, the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm going, oh crap. This is not a good place to be. No job, no nothing. But I mean, it's kind of part and parcel for being a consultant. You're always unemployed, except when you're not unemployed, in which case you're really thinking that unemployment would be a good thing to do right now. But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
I had been writing articles for Tech Target, which is DSC's company. That they had acquired them back about a year before I'd started there. And one of the editors say, "Hey, we've got a new editorial position for Data Science Central." I'm going, "Well, I've been contributing to Data Science Central for 5 years, and that sounds good." And I took it on. It's been fun. We have just after about a year, we converted everything, about 20,000 plus articles going back to about 2012. Converted them over from one platform over to WordPress. And it was an interesting experience watching a large organization essentially dealing with something that, I think individually you'd probably do in 2-3 months in order to be able to facilitate all of the things involved in moving this over. It's taken a year, but we actually went live with the new version last week. So I am immensely happy because I've got a much better operating system to be able to work with than I had before, and it looks pretty. And now I can write all kinds of interesting articles with code and nice little diagrams and other things like that. I was largely having to do behind the scenes before. So
Awesome.
anyway, Data Science Central is primarily focused on what I call AI in a very broad sense. And that is to say, it's my focus as managing editor, as community editor for this particular site is essentially to look at all of the big trends that are data centric and weave them together into some kind of fabric. But it's mostly content that is provided by or working with our stable of contributors. Anyone can basically contact me and say, "Hey, we'd be interested in writing an article." If you write to Cagle at techtarget.com, and say, "I'd like to be able to publish an article on your site," I will happily set up a membership. We may have to talk about exactly what that is, but I want to hear from people. I want to hear from the community about, anything. And we talk about things exactly like we're talking about here, talking about data, talking about how that influences the world, how, getting deep into it, but also talking to the C-suite. and just explore it.
Hmm. So you are looking for contributors then. So if folks in the audience are interested in submitting an article, they can do that with you.
Yes, please, by all means.
All right, everybody, you heard. Contact Kurt if you want to submit an article to Data Science Central. I think that's a good opportunity for both parties actually here. So thank you for that background, Kurt. Today we are here to talk about the future of work, right? And I think when we look back 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, it's very hard for us to predict what the future would look like. But we have some ideas, a lot of times based on inferences of smart people like yourself. So I'd love to hear from you, maybe just a general statement of where are we going with the future of work. Will there be work in the future? Maybe we start with that.
It's all going to be people pressing buttons. You look at George Jetson back in the 1970s, and that's the future of work, really.
Hmm.
No, that's not the future of work, and please don't believe that it is the future of work. Um, it's funny. I think the problem that we have, that anyone has when talking about this, is that you basically end up framing these questions in terms of information that you know.
Hmm.
And we know what work is. Work started out, the modern job, the modern job that we think of today is kind of a parody, or at least a semblance of a lot of ideas that first started showing up back about 1950. And this was after World War II. Some of this had been kind of building in the background before, but it was really after that period that our modern conception of what office work in particular looks like really began to take shape. And in many respects, a lot of the conventions, huge number of conventions about how we think about work, has largely come from these preconceptions. And unfortunately, most of those are now going away. Or maybe fortunately, actually, I think fortunately, most of those are going away. So the problem that I think that a lot of people have when thinking about this is they think about it in terms of, okay, are robots going to replace me? Is AI going to replace me? Is am I going to be redundant in this whole field? When the question I think that needs to be asked is, what exactly do we mean by work?
Hmm.
Um, I mean, look at us. We're sitting here having a conversation about data. You know, is this work? It's something that obviously, from your standpoint, it's something that does provide a source of revenue. But realistically, you're doing this because you probably looked at this and said, one, it's an interesting opportunity. I like to be able to sit here and interview people, and I can tell you do it very well. But I but I also think that we look at this and we have some real trouble thinking about this as work, because it's not what we have our mental conception of when we talk about work. And I think that in many respects, a lot of the paradigms that we've come to establish about what exactly work means have largely been discredited quietly, but we haven't realized it.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually kind of answering another question, and I'm gonna come back to the larger arc of this. But the idea behind this is actually very intriguing. One thing that I fully expect, I think the future that we're facing right now, we're early.
Hmm.
We basically pulled the future forward by about 10 years, um, by having the pandemic, because we needed to, because
Hmm.
we were desperately in need of being able to communicate with one another,
Yeah.
in terms of trying to keep the entire economy from collapsing because all of a sudden no one could get into the office.
Yeah.
And I think that because we have pulled so much of that future forward, there is a huge amount of disruption in terms of our perceptions that we normally would not have really noticed until we were there. This is where we should have been about 2030,
Hmm.
maybe a little bit later. But this is the future. We're in the future now that we would have been about 10 years from now if we'd gone down the other leg of the trousers and not gotten sick with the pandemic.
Yeah.
So as a consequence, when you actually, sorry, go on. I
No,
interrupted.
I just wanted to make a small comment on that. I know somebody who, before the pandemic, really wanted to work from home, and their company said, there's no way we can handle this. This is impossible. And then, a few weeks later, if you have to get that, you can't. Guys, this is live. This
No,
is
I'm not.
definitely
I'm turning it off.
no. Okay. Yeah,
That's the other problem you run into with work. Yes. Sorry. Go on.
Yeah, so the individual really wanted to work from home, and the company basically said, we don't have the capabilities, the infrastructure is just not set up for this. And now, 2.5 years later, this person's still working from home for that same company. So within weeks, really, they went from no, this is not possible to okay, let's everybody work from home now. So you're absolutely right. It did speed things up in a big way for a lot of people.
And in many respects, we dodged a bullet here,
Yeah.
because if this had happened 10 years ago, I think the disruption would have been far more profound
Hmm.
because we didn't have the infrastructure in place.
Yeah.
We had we had enough of the infrastructure in place in 2020 that we were essentially able to bootstrap ourselves moving forward in a way that I think 10 years ago we wouldn't have been able to do, and we would be in a deep recession right now,
Hmm.
because it would have pretty much wiped out a huge chunk of the ability of this country,
Yeah.
the world, to be able to function.
Yeah.
And so I think that if you look at it from that perspective, um, you know, part of the reason that it's so hard to talk about the future of work is because we're in it, we're there, um, and so I think that has, in many respects, it's kind of changed our perceptions about what exactly is going on and what we're expecting. But there's a lot of different pieces that all come into this.
Mhm.
One of it really kind of comes down to, um, with we're now at a point where we're a year and a half to two, well, a year and a half, yeah, coming up on 2 years of the
Mhm.
pandemic, and
Yeah.
um, we're at the stage where, um, I think that all the changes, a lot of companies are basically saying, well, when all this ends, we're going to bring everyone back into the office. It's not going to happen. It's too late. The horses are now out in the field. They've left the barn. They're on their way to Poughkeepsie.
Yeah.
Um, and because they're on their way to Poughkeepsie, a lot of companies are now scrambling because their entire model, and this is especially true for older companies, their entire model was predicated upon geofencing, upon pulling people together into a room or an office and communicating with them.
Yeah.
Um, and because of that, what's happened now is that it means that, um, it's going to be very difficult for companies that say you have to come back into the office to do so. It's even going to be fairly difficult for companies to say, we want you to be in the office 2 days a week, because that's almost as disruptive, if not more disruptive in some respects, than
Yeah.
not coming into the office at all.
Yeah.
Um, I think where we're going is what I see as being kind of conventional, where, um, increasingly the expectation is going to be, okay, even after the pandemic, we're going to basically give everyone a paid ticket off to Bora Bora, and we're going to get everyone into Bora Bora and have great time for the next 2 weeks, and we'll talk about promoting the company. We'll bring in our best clients. We'll do all of these things in a concentrated fashion, and then everyone goes off and disperses again.
Right.
And I think that is actually the model that I think we're moving towards. But we haven't quite got there yet, simply because gathering is still very problematic.
It is. It is. And at some point last year, I thought we've put all those issues behind us, and then came December and January with a whole new
Yeah.
wave. Okay, so Kurt, we have some questions in the audience. So I'll take Petrie's question here first. He says, looking back over 30 years ago, what did people think about how future of work will look like today?
It didn't look like this. I mean, the reality is that when we talked about work, I wrote I wrote a book about 10 years ago for a private client that
Okay.
basically talked about this, and I actually did mention the fact that I really felt that we were getting to the stage where people were going to be working from home, where
Mhm.
in fact, once you eliminate the need to be able to have to bring people together for collaboration, for whatever, then essentially it also changes the way that you think about how you organize your business day, how you organize or structure your time. In essence, what we've done is we've said, okay, everyone, you are now essentially independent contractors that are working offsite, and it's a model that is. I saw it coming, but I don't think most people did. And I think most people tended to look at it as okay, the future of work is going to be, well, we might sit here on the beach and I'd love to sit on the beach and type, although they've got pretty lousy Wi-Fi there. But I think that no one really hit upon the fact that once you decentralize, once you break the tethers to the office, it
Mhm.
really changes the very nature of the relationship of the employees to their employer.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think that's really the thing that nobody wanted to talk about 30 years ago, or even
Mhm.
10 years ago. The idea that you wouldn't come into an office. It was kind of the conception of, what does the office look like? You've got these big open plans, and I was saying, it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter, because people basically are basically being asked more and more to do creative things that are essentially largely done in private. They're
Mhm.
done where you need to occasionally collaborate,
Yeah.
but that collaboration, if anything, is actually better done through some kind of intermediating tools. You think about something like Slack or Teams or whatever,
Mhm.
but we're at a point now where when we are collaborating, we have a vehicle for collaboration that largely is able to say, here is a memory of this meeting. Here is a
Right.
memory of these interactions.
Mhm.
And that ability, that focus on being able to take that memory and use it as data is actually pretty profound, because it shifts the whole way that you think about a meeting. Um, as, from something that, okay, you just come in and you collaborate, to, okay, we have a bundle of actions that we have essentially developed. We have a log and a history, and we can actually go back and search the thinking that went into play at various points. That's a pretty profound thing. That's a pretty profound concept.
Yeah.
you know you've thrown away. I mean, we're so far past the concept of the secretary in the corner sitting in and doing dictation.
Right.
because none of that ever actually was searchable. There was never any specific memory there
Yeah.
that came into play. Now that's changed dramatically. Now everything that we do, every interaction that we have with one another has the potential to be logged.
Yes. And now we have apps. We don't need people typing anymore. We have an app that will listen, type it for you, and it's searchable, which is a great point. So Kurt, I do want to do that first giveaway here. So just folks, a reminder that hashtag dedicated to get into the raffle here to win a dedicated inner circle membership. Type that into with whichever platform you're joining us from. As you're doing that, Kurt, I know you really wanted to tell the audience about your suspenders. I think this is a good time for this while we're waiting.
The suspenders were a complete accident. I was wearing a belt at the point, and unfortunately, as you can tell me, I'm a little bit on the portly side, sadly to say. Um, so I had a belt one day, and it finally gave up the ghost and said, "Okay, I just Kurt, I can't do this anymore." And so I rushed into a store looking for belts, and I saw belts, and then I looked in the corner, and there were these wonderful Robin Williams rainbow suspenders hanging there, and I just could not walk away, and I've worn them every day since.
Wow.
This is part of my uniform now. And particularly since I've always been a big fan of Robin Williams, it was kind of like, okay, I can live with this.
I love it. I think everyone should have like a thing. I know someone else who wears like a big green bow tie, and people have a special hat. I know Scott Taylor, I don't know if he's in the audience, he has a truth hat he wears. You've got the suspenders. I have a dedicated pillow, but my cat's kind of sleeping on it right now. But anyways, I think it's fun.
They're guarding it. Yes, that's very
Yeah.
important. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. People are loving your suspenders here. So I'm gonna go ahead and
Thank you.
do the draw our first giveaway here. So good luck, everybody. Thank you for playing. We'll do one more of these towards the end of the session. All right, our first winner here is Kevin Flanagan. Congratulations, Kevin. Thank you. Thank you for playing. We will follow up after the show. All right, Kurt, I know we have plenty of questions that came in via comments, but before I get to that, I want to ask, for folks listening in the audience, whether they are students in college or graduating or interns or, sort of in that early phase of their career, or if they are maybe not even in the data space, but are curious about getting into this data space from another career. How do both of these groups of individuals work on future proofing their career, let's say for the next 15 years or so?
Okay. So one of the things to keep in mind is that I think that we need to recognize the fact that we are entering into the augmentation era. Truth be told, there are things that robots can do very well. I think a lot of things in manufacturing, for instance, robots are actually preferable to people in that there are things that they can continue. The old John Henry analogy of the machine. At the end of the day, John Henry is swinging the hammer and the machine is there, and John managed to actually complete the task, but it was the machines, unfortunately, that ultimately became the heroes, or at least the victors in that particular struggle. And it's something that we need to understand. That's the reality that we're facing right now. Things get a little fuzzier when you start talking about creative work and about areas like programming and data science and really marketing, anything that really has to do with using cerebral processes. Because while you can do some very interesting things with machine learning and with deep learning, which is essentially machine learning with kernels. The truth is that a good machine learning algorithm is never going to be novel, almost by definition. You're basically always going to be looking back based upon the data that's come in. And so novelty is one of the key things that is always going to be, it's something that human beings are actually very good at.
Mm-hmm.
Even in situations where a machine learning system or an AI system says, hey, here are some choices or recommendations, ultimately they're just that. They're just, here's what other people have done in the past, and you may want to think about it. But if you're a creative individual, chances are you're going to say, okay, this is something I can borrow or incorporate, but it's something that is only part of what I am doing.
Right.
And that in and of itself is actually a very important distinction, because if your job is ultimately creative, then I think that the upshot of that is that at least for the next 15 years, we're going to be in a situation where the ability of AI to augment and to supplement the ability of the human being is actually going to be pretty significant.
Mm-hmm.
After that, things get a lot fuzzy. But I think that at least from that standpoint, there's definitely room there. Um, but it also basically means that when you're thinking about areas like programming and data science, those are areas where, to be perfectly honest, what your real strengths are where your real strengths are going to be places where it's your role as the analyst, your role
Mm-hmm.
as the programmer or the creative, to essentially take the information that you're getting from this and to help not necessarily derive insights, although that's part of it. But I think more to the point, to be able to then the apply what you're getting out of the process to the work that you're doing, which to my mind says, okay, you're going to continue to see more specialization. You're going to see fewer data scientists, and you're going to see more SMEs that are essentially trained to use data science methods.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of people that are really focused, and this is true in programming as well, the number of people that are focused on, building things um, specifically, as general purpose products, are going to become instead increasingly focused on specializations. And that's always been true, but I think it's more true today than it has been. Um, I think if I was coming into the field as a data scientist today, yeah,
Yeah.
I would study things like R and Python, because those are kind of the tools that you end up using in that particular space. But you also have to understand that most of those tools anymore are actually hidden behind GUIs, behind UXs, behind other things where people have essentially already done a lot of the heavy lifting of
Mm-hmm.
taking these analyses and these tools, and said, okay, well, let's abstract this out to developing pipelines and towards trying to be able to say what kinds of tests you need to be able to run, and then to run the tests on those. And I think this is actually where a lot of that is going. I also think that becoming a storyteller is actually becoming more and more of a skill over
Mm-hmm.
time. You are basically communicating to an audience, whether that audience is something like this, whether you're talking to a boardroom full of executives, whether you're talking to people out in the wild that are trying to make decisions about their healthcare.
Yeah.
That ability to communicate is actually, I think, one of the strongest pieces that anyone has going in. And I think that if you, especially for those people like me who started out as really geeky techno nerds
Yeah.
and just have learned over the years to become communicators, um, that's a good skill to develop. Learn how to speak to others, learn how to communicate effectively. The math and the programming, those will change over time, but the ability to tell a cohesive, truthful, and accurate story, I
Yeah.
think, is actually one of the biggest things that you could be looking at any point in your career.
Yeah, and I'd recommend coupling that with telling stories through the metaverse because it seems like that's where everything is flowing. I'm honestly very behind with that, with the metaverse. I like real life and real people, so it's
Oh,
interesting how that turns out.
I've been immersed in the metaverse. I think every project I've worked on in the last 6 months has been in some way or form touched to it. And I actually wrote an editorial yesterday
Okay.
talking about this. Um, the thing to keep in mind about the metaverse, and to a certain extent about what I call Web 3.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people, especially in the blockchain and ICO space, that say, well, Web 3 is blockchain. I'm saying bull blank bleep. Um, yeah, no. Blockchain is blockchain is a wonderful mechanism for doing speculation on a questionable market. But it's also, I think it actually hints at something bigger.
Hmm.
Um, there's a project going on right now through the W3C that is I'm watching very closely. It's called Solid, um, and the idea behind Solid is essentially you have the ability to create, and it's partially a specification for hosts as much as it is for users, but it's essentially a way of being able to build personal knowledge graphs.
Hmm.
And it's one of Tim Berners-Lee's biggest efforts to date, and I think it's really profound because a significant amount of what we call data is actually not data; it's metadata. It's information about things. There's really two different areas that you have. You have transactional data, which is basically something happened at this point with these people doing these things. But you also have metadata that basically talks about who did this, why did they do it, where was the context, and that
Yeah.
context is actually very important. And so a lot of what I see with Solid is the idea of saying you have individual data pods, and everybody can have a pod.
Right.
There's actually a group up on the Solid site where several different providers of pods. I have a feeling there's going to be many, 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 many more. But the idea then is that pod essentially allows you to tell a story, to essentially create the pieces necessary to store information about anything, not just about a person or a place, but about a novel, about a where are my drones at this point in time,
Yeah.
about uh, what's the political structure of the Ukraine in 2022. And how does it apply to the political structure of surrounding regions? Um, but the idea behind the pods is that they essentially form a network.
Hmm.
And one of the problems that I see with most data processing is it's basically all local. It's not connected in any reasonable manner. Um,
I love how loud your ringtone is. It's so good.
I'm sorry. I
No, no, no
really am.
worries.
Um, but it's fundamental in that because you have this, you have the ability to basically say, here is information. It's
Mhm.
information that we can basically search and manipulate and query and update, but it's also information that we can send and use databases as nodes in the network. And that right there is the foundation of the metaverse.
Mhm.
Because when you get right down to it, the metaverse is essentially shared worlds or shared contexts.
Yeah.
In order for you and I to be able to communicate, in order for me as Thor Jorgensen, dwarf warrior, to be able to take on, to battle uh, Kate Strakninsky, the Russian elven maiden or Russian elven magician. You have to have context. You have
Right.
to have ways of being able to say, okay, what's common between you? What do you communicate with? And I think that ultimately is what's going to be the foundation for persistence, which is the key thing for the metaverse. It's not identity, it's persistence of identity that
Mhm.
becomes so critical. And this actually kind of goes back to the future of work, because when you start saying, okay, I need to be able to build context with other people,
Mhm.
that's work. That
Right.
interchange that you're doing is usually going to facilitate certain kinds of interactions. Now, the bigger question of, well, exactly how do you get compensation for that? That's the big question. And that's a question that I think is actually going to completely rewrite everything we know about economics.
Wow. Well,
Um,
I can't wait to see it all. That's
I'm
definitely
terrified of it. I
yeah.
think it's gonna. I think it's going there's we haven't begun to see future shock yet. I mean, this is
Mhm.
this is this is future shock and steroids coming, and it's
Yeah.
coming fast.
In the next like 1 or 2 years, you think, or
Not that fast, thank God.
okay.
Um,
Okay.
uh,
We have
but
time.
I do think that it will be within the next 10 to 15.
Mhm.
We're getting to the stage. I looked at it in the essay that I wrote. I basically said, hey, you can think of the metaverse ultimately as a gaming environment. If you think about gaming as any time where you are interacting with other people in a shared context.
Yeah.
Um, and because of that need to be able to maintain a common persistence, what I call context, which is another book that I'm writing, but it's a book that I've got many, many chapters to, and none of them are quite ready for prime time yet. But the idea behind context is really that you have to be able to find a common language for sharing information, recognizing the fact that people are always, always spinning off new languages every time they get together.
Mhm.
It's language evolves, and it's like a virus. It can evolve very slowly, or it
Yeah.
can evolve very rapidly. And that's the challenge of being an ontologist, someone who basically works with understanding the foundations of language. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
I just wanted to let those in the audience know the article that Kurt was just talking about. I've shared a link to the article in the chat. So if you wanted to check that out after the show, definitely recommend it. I think we have time for maybe two more questions. So let's start with a question here from Bob. He's asking to hear your thoughts on the dynamics of going to a potential 4-day work week for those working from home.
um, it's a good question. I think the question ultimately comes down to which 4 days and why are you and I'm struggling normally to be able to get everything that I'm trying to do done in 7 days.
Really interesting.
Um, and part of that is because I do a lot of different things. I'm
Hmm.
as I said, I wear a lot of invisible hats. Um, but the other side of that is that I think that What we have done is to essentially say, okay, you're an adult now. You should be the person who is essentially managing your own schedule. And to the extent that you need to interact with other people, if you need to do something in your personal life, then do it. As long as the focus shifts away from, do I have butts in seats at certain times of the day,
Yeah.
and move towards, am I accomplishing my goals and objectives that I have stated? That to me is another profound change that is
Yeah.
going on. Now, I think realistically, I find that I normally fall into a 3-2-2 schedule, where Mondays and Fridays for me are almost invariably, I don't do any interviews. I don't, I may do a lot of work, but that work is essentially something where I'm focused on this particular problem and I don't want to be interrupted. Tuesdays to Thursdays for me, generally, those are days where I schedule my meetings. Those
Hmm.
are days that I say, okay, these are days that we should, as an organization, all time to concentrate. And then the weekend is still the weekend. It
Yeah.
basically says you need to take, you're a human being, you're not a machine. You need to take a break and do something that doesn't involve, you know, getting a paycheck.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but I'm not always good about that. And yes, there have been times that I'm working at 11:30 at night or 3 in the morning, or whenever, because that's what the need calls for.
Right.
But I think that's where I think we're going, is that kind of 3-2-2 schedule.
It's very interesting because that is my exact schedule. So in June of last year, I stopped taking calls on Fridays because I figured it doesn't mean I'm not going to work, but I just didn't want to have any calls. Like a day to focus, clean the house, do other stuff. And then starting earlier this year, I decided I will also not take any calls on Monday. So I also don't have calls Mondays and Fridays. Weekends are also my human days. And then Tuesday through Thursday is when I do my conference calls and collaborative work. So if we can all agree that we only take calls Tuesdays through Thursdays, I think that's going to be a good way forward, because then we can
Mhm.
expect others to also be available on those days. I think that can work well. Um, we had another question here, interesting one from Kimberly, and this is more focused on America, right? So, how do you think the future of work will affect healthcare and social security in America?
Uh, I think the American healthcare system is collapsing. And part of that is, again, healthcare was basically predicated upon working, which made sense at the time when it was first started out in about 1950. It no longer does. And I think that one of the problems that we're facing right now is there's a real tension between those that are basically looking to move back to the 1950s, where everything was nice and predictable, and you got your health care through your businesses, to be perfectly honest, really don't want that burden.
Yeah.
But they're afraid that if they don't offer that and again, horses and stables, that people will basically go elsewhere, because if you take away the health care and the social security from being a business concern, then it's one less thing to keep your people
Hmm.
working towards your particular goals. And it's a pretty nasty, it's a pretty coercive way of thinking.
Yeah.
Um, I think that you know, I really think that because of the nature of that, it's really caused some fundamental problems in our society. And I think that to move forward in terms of saying, okay, healthcare is a right. It's a right that you should reasonably pay, but you should also pay reasonably.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I've seen both the American and the Canadian healthcare system, and I far prefer the Canadian, even though it has its own wrinkles. because you know that you will get the care that you need, if not necessarily the care that you want. The same thing applies for Social Security. Social Security is a good idea. Unfortunately, it is also a good idea that failed to take into account demographics,
Mm.
because everyone kind of assumed, looking at Social Security, that okay, when Eisenhower was talking about Social Security in the 1950s, the population was booming. The birth rate was like 4.2 children per family. Today, the birth rate is actually below 1.7. Okay. You
Yeah.
need 2.1 people, 2.1 children, a little bit of a sliver of a child. I don't really want to even think about that one. But you need 2.1 children to basically replace the population. And we have not had that. We came very close in about 1997.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the last time that we even got close to replacement rate. And so what's happening now is that we have this giant demographic wave, largely based upon the baby boomers, who started out this whole process.
Right.
Now essentially going in reverse. And by the late 2040s, early 2050s, the population in the U.S. is actually going to start is actually going to start dropping, because you won't have enough immigration to be able to cover the number of people that are no longer in the workforce.
Hmm.
And it's a real problem that's going to hit, especially starting in about, oh, give or take about 5 years,
Okay.
because in
2027.
2008, um, you ended up you had the Great Recession, and the birth rate basically, which was already fairly low at the time, just plummeted, and it's been
Mm-hmm.
plummeting ever since. It actually had a slight blip just before the pandemic, but it continues to fall. It's now down. It's now down to um, like 1.67,
Hmm.
something along those lines. But it's down enough that it's we're going to be in a situation where we won't have enough people in the labor force, not just to support Social Security, but to be able to actually do things in the labor force. We're going to be in a chronic underemployment situation, or
Well, would some
overemployment
of that,
situation.
w- sorry to interrupt, but would some of that be offset by, I guess, the robots that are obviously
So
coming to take
yes,
over?
some of it obviously will. I mean
Yeah.
that there is definitely that. It, but the thing to keep in mind is that those robots really have significant limitations, and I am not convinced. First of all, there's any kind of AI is essentially kind of an illusion, because it will tell you what has already happened, but it's not creative. It's also not real good about anticipating black swan events.
Mm-hmm.
It's not good at basically saying, okay, what happens when this emergency occurs?
Right.
Um, and because of that, it kind of gets back to the whole question of when we have driverless cars. Well, we're going to have cars that are capable of driving themselves sooner than we have driverless cars, because there's always a question of liability. And there's
Mm-hmm.
always a question of the fact, and this applies especially for truckers and long haul shipping and things like that. You still need to have people to maintain security, to
Yeah.
be there when things break down. You're not going to go away. It just means that they're not having to sit there in the seat holding the steering wheel.
Right.
As it turns out, it's sometimes useful to have someone sitting there at the seat, holding the steering wheel.
Just
But
in case.
what
Yeah.
happens here is that it changes. You're not going to lose that many of those people, and I think a lot of people that are thinking about this from the perspective of, these things are going to replace my jobs. They're not taking into account the fact that no, robots are stupid. AI is stupid. It's
Called
very good for
artificial
doing.
intelligence. Kurt,
Well, that's the
intelligence.
problem.
It's in the name.
We have been trying to deal with artificial intelligence for almost as long as we've had computers.
Yeah.
And you could do some pretty impressive things with them. And they're great for classification. They're great for being able to do things. And yes, those machines are capable of driving themselves, but they are capable only if you are in a situation where you have someone close enough by that when things go sour,
Right.
the situation can be salvaged.
Yeah.
And
You're
I don't think that's going to change. I mean, that same concept applies to drones.
mhm.
I think that yes, you can automate drones now. It's not a hard task to basically say, okay, move up, move left, move right, move up, so forth and so on. It's a lot harder, however, to basically put a drone into a real world situation and say, okay, we need to get from point A to point B, and it's your task to figure out how.
Right.
It's doable, but it also requires a surprising amount of coordination, the standardization at multiple levels, as well as you know. I mean, one of the groups that I work with is called the Spatial Web Foundation, and they actually deal with a lot of questions like this. How do you deal with automated drones? How do you deal with systems where those drones are essentially not supervised? And the answer is actually it's a very, very, very challenging problem because there are so many parameters and there are so many ways that things can go wrong. I think that it will happen,
Yeah.
uh, but it requires a lot of contextual information that be shared in the right way at the right time without overwhelming the systems that you have. And
Hmm.
it's going to take a while for that to fully manifest itself. And even if it does, it's going to be something that they're working within very, very strict parameters. So, I'm not too worried. I'd really love to be able to sit back and read a novel while I'm driving off to, wherever I'm driving to. But I'm not worried about putting people out of work as drivers.
I think this paints a very realistic picture for people because a lot of times they're like, oh no, the robots are coming to take my job, and then sometimes you're trying to download a video from your phone and it's taking hours to download a 5-minute video, or if you don't have the right Wi-Fi, so then you're picturing your car trying to make sure that you're maintaining the right signals and everything is working just perfectly, and the amount of data that goes into self-driving cars, and we were talking about trucks earlier, is probably even more so. I think we are quite a bit away from that being our reality, but very, very interesting conversation here with you, Kurt. I want to do our giveaway now, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen one more time. It's hashtag dedicated for those who want to enter the raffle, and then we'll wrap up. We did have a question earlier. Couldn't find it in the chat. There's so many comments that came in, but people wanted to know again where to go to submit the articles. I think you mentioned an email earlier.
Yes. So to submit, send it to Cagle, K-C-A-G-L-E, at
Mhm.
datasciencecentral.com.
Data Site Central. Okay.
Actually, sorry, at techtarget.com. The other one should work, but it's not at the moment. So at
Okay.
techtarget.com.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. All right. I'm going to go ahead and draw again for our next giveaway. Let's see. Our second winner here is Andrew Jones. Congratulations, Andrew. I'll make sure to follow up with you after the show. And Kurt, I want to give you a huge thank you for getting on the show, for telling
Thank
us
you.
all about the future of work, for telling us your story about the suspenders. I think it was was great to get to know you a little bit more. I encourage everyone to go and check out Data Science Central. I know there's a lot of great content out there. If people wanted to continue the conversation with you, Kurt, is it easier for you on LinkedIn, Twitter, or where is it easier to find you?
I'm on LinkedIn. Just type in Kurt Cagle, and you'll see my ugly shining mug staring back at you. So.
Staring, perfect. I love it. Awesome. Kurt, thank you so much for being on the Dedicated Show. A pleasure speaking with you, and I've definitely learned a lot. So thank you, and thank you for everyone in the audience for joining us and for being for engaging in the conversation as well.